Welcome to the day 3 of Wise Unity workshop. We are just going to quickly recap what we did last week, and we are going to see what are some other ways of posting Wise events in Unity through scripting. So, we have discussed what are functions and methods. Functions are basically just lines of codes that we can call anywhere in our script or anywhere in our project. Functions can have arguments that we have seen already, such as the post event function, which takes in the name of the event as for the first argument and the game object as its second argument. We have seen the functions in action when we made the animation events. So we are using animation events for our footsteps event that we posted in this function, and this function is being called by the animation event in our players object. Now we have also seen what are variables. Variables are something that can store data. The data type for variables can vary, such as an integer, that is a whole number, a float, that is an integer with a decimal, a string value, that is basically plain text, and a boolean value, that is either true or false. We are going to see boolean values in action today. We still have to see what they do and how they function, and we also saw that we can perform operations on variables. So anything such as mathematical operations or comparisons, like we made this counter for our footsteps. Every time this variable is being called in this function, its value is being updated by 1. So it's a counter for footsteps. uh, we also saw how we can communicate through code through the console in Unity, and we can write statements to ourselves, so we know that this block of code has been executed and this is working properly. So that's what we covered last week. Now, in today's session, we are going to look at something called as if statements. This is the third and final concept of coding that we are going to cover in this workshop. And this is basically the starting tools you will need in order to get started with um, how to work with code and how to sort of use these things to identify where the blocks of code are that we are going to use, that we're going to see in other scripts. So if statements, they are also called conditional statements, conditional loops. We are going to see them in action as well. So let's see what we have in Unity. Inside Unity, it is exactly where we left it last time. We made this new animation script events, but we are not using anything from this. We still have the footsteps from our previous animation event script, which is using the player fs as the footsteps value. Now, how do we identify where sort of events that don't fit into animation events go? So last week we discussed that our player object has some associated animations with it, but not everything can be an animation event. So if you notice in this drop down, we have an animation for a lot of things, such as attack, we have the dash, we have being dead, double jump, run, but we do not have an animation for jumping. There is a double jump animation, but what you'll see quickly is that this double jump is not being called on the jump trigger. Like, this double jump is specifically for the player when it jumps for the second time. Now let's actually see this in action, what I'm talking about. Yeah, so if I jump, you see I can double jump in midair. That second jump is what's using this double jump animation, and it already has a function that we have defined. We have defined this in the animation scripts where it's using the jump function. Now since the sound of the jump is same for both the jump and double jump, I'm just using the jump function here, which is posting the jump event from our Wise. Now how do we know where our initial jump function would be, or like how our initial jump mechanics in the game would be? Now to sort of look at this, we know that this action is being performed on the player object. So we go to the player object, inside which you will see there are multiple scripts that are already inside this object. So these are all custom defined scripts that are responsible to handle certain actions or certain movements of the player. So let's see one of these scripts that is called the character controller 2D. I'll open the script, inside which you'll see a lot of code, and that is a lot of code. We are not going to look at all of it off, obviously, because like as sound designers we are not really concerned with the mechanics or the code of the game itself, but this session particularly is going to show you how you can sort of approach to find the section of code that you need to work with. Now we are looking at the jump mechanic. We need to post a sound on the jump mechanic of the game. How do we tackle that? So inside the script, you will already start noticing that we have some knowledge of what's going on. So at the very start, you can already see there are so many variables defined. All of these are variables that has a certain value, and these are being used somewhere in the code to do certain actions or to store data or do anything that a variable does. And if we keep scrolling, you'll immediately see after the variables we have functions. So everything in orange that you see in my Visual Studio Code is a function, and these functions have a block of code that is being executed every time these functions are called. So we saw last week that awake and update are two functions in Unity that are responsible to execute the code uh, on awake. When the awake is called, that's when the game is booting up, while the update is responsible to update the values of its code or to constantly run this code for every frame that your game is running on. So these will be constantly updated. um, and you'll see this goes on. We have a lot of different functions inside this. Below the update and awake functions, you'll see there's a function called move, inside which now there's this new concept called an if statement. It's using a lot of if statements to define conditions. Now how does if statements work? Let's see that first, so we can come back to this and understand more about how to post our jump function. What we are saying to Unity here is basically that if whatever conditions are defined here are true, only then go ahead and execute this block of code, or else you can skip this block of code and move to the other block of code that is defined in the else block. So we can define conditions inside these brackets. We can have multiple conditions, and there's sort of different ways to write these conditions. So I can have like a variable comparison. So maybe I have a variable 01 with a certain value, and I need to check that if it's equal to variable 02, and if this line is true, that if variable 1 has the exact same value as variable 2, only then this block of code will execute, or else it will move to the next block. So that's how we can define statements. And we also use something called as these operators. So we have and, we have or, we have equals, or we have a not function, not operator. So there are different ways we could implement these conditions, but the purpose of these conditions are basically, if everything in this is true, if statement is responsible to check if the conditions are true, like not the individual conditions but like the entire statement, if all of this is true, only then this block of code will execute. Now how are we using this in our code? Now there is this function in our main character controller that's called move. So that should already give us an idea, okay, this is a function that is responsible to sort of control the player movement. Now you will find a lot of comments in these codes. If you're working with a developer, if they're like professionally doing game development, then they will most likely always have some comments to sort of define what this block of code is doing, what this line of code is doing. And you'll see I've added my own code, so I've also added some comments myself, which starts with GAI for Game Audio India, and I've basically defined what that line of code is doing. And we just write these comments with a double slash, so everything after this double slash will be ignored by Unity. This will not be included in the code. This is just plain text at this point. So okay, now the first thing that we need to do in order to sort of approach how we can implement the jump sound is to start at the variable. We start at what we already know. We are looking for a variable that references jumping or just jump of the player. So if I just see, there are a lot of variables that has jump in its name, like there's a can double jump, there is a particle jumper, particle jump down, but there is nothing as such that defines jump itself, just jump. So we move on, we just keep scrolling and see if there is something that resembles jumping. We are back to our move function, where I see there is a boolean variable called jump defined, inside which we'll also see there is a comment which just gives it away that okay, this, if the player should jump, then this block of code is handling that. So that is our cue, that is exactly what we are looking for. We are looking for the section of code that is responsible to handle the mechanics of player jumping. Inside this, you will see in this section, we are using if statements. Now, this is not written by me, this code already existed. I just added a line of code at the end of this if statement of this if condition to post my player jump event. Now, how do I know this is exactly where this code should be? We do that through understanding what the conditions of the if statement are. So in this particular case, we saw these are boolean variables. The m grounded jump and jump, these are boolean variables that has some value in the code. These are defined by the developer. These are not my variables. I did not create these, but these variables are being used somewhere in the code for updating the value of, in this case for m grounded, it's updating the value of whether the player is standing on ground or not on ground. So if the player is standing on ground, the value of this m grounded would be true. Since it's a boolean variable, it can only have a true or a false as its value. And for jump, we just saw it's also a boolean variable, and we are not concerned with where it's being updated or how it's being used. We just understand that okay, this condition is telling Unity to check if the player is currently standing on ground, and it also has to check if the jump action is true, the jump action is performed, if the player jumps. If that is true, and this or this M grounded is also true, only then this block of code will execute. Now we can also check this through um, debug.log statements. When we write this debug.log statements, we don't really need to worry about the posting event. We can just see in the game that if this is the right place to post the event. To check that, we simply just go back to our Unity, let it compile the code, and let's try playing the game. But we'll look at the console to see if it writes this debug.log statement, jump is triggered, when I perform the jump action on the player. So let's play the game. And I will perform a jump. And as you can see, there is a statement in our debug.log that says jump is triggered. And this is perfect. This is exactly what we want. This is where our jump event should be posted. Now let's look at some other things that is using a similar setup. Okay, now there is one other mechanic that is using a very similar condition to jumping sound, that is wall slide. Now if I go over to this wall, yeah, as you saw, the sound for these wall slides are also something that we need to put in. How do we sort of look at where the code needs to be? Again, the purpose of this session, for today's session, is not to teach you the lines of code, but sort of to teach you the mindset that you need in order to approach the code, and just to find the sections that we need to work with, that we need in order to post Wise events. So we have variables. Will again, I'm using the same process to implement every sound. Now we are looking at the wall slide sound in particular. We want to implement the sound where the player is sliding on the wall and slipping down. And how do we approach that? So I'm in the character controller 2D script again, and I'm looking at the variables, and I can immediately see there is a variable for is wall sliding, and the comment also says if the player is sliding in a wall. That's perfect. That's exactly what we need in order to uh, post the wall sliding event. So let's see where this variable is being used. I'll go into the code. What I simply did is select this variable, highlight this variable, and click Command D on my Mac to see where else this variable is being used. So I'm seeing there's a lot of conditions that are using this variable, but what we want to see is, now by default the value for this is wall sliding is given as false. It's a boolean variable, so the value for this is given false. because when we start the game, by default the player is not wall sliding, it's the, the player is standing on the ground. So this has to be false by default. But now we are supposed to look for a code that says that triggers that this boolean variable is true, that changes the value for this particular variable. Now let's look at that. I'm going to just keep hitting command D until I find a code, a line of code that is going to change the value of its of the boolean to true from false, which is in this line of code. Yeah, as you can see here, this line, now we're not concerned with everything else. Whatever else this code is doing, we don't care. What we need is that this is wall sliding is being set to true in this block of code. We know now that this is where our wall sliding is being updated in this particular else if statement, inside which what I've done is defined a custom condition for if statements. What I'm doing is I'm again using a m grounded variable, but this time I'm checking if the player is not grounded. I'm using this exclamation for the not operator, but we are checking if the value for this variable is false, because at this point we are wall sliding and we do not want the player to be on ground. So the condition is that if the player is not on ground and if the player is wall sliding, so this is supposed to be true, while I've defined a custom boolean variable here which we'll get to in a moment. But all of this reads as if m grounded is false and is wall sliding is true and ws is false, only then you can go ahead and execute this block of code. So this is just another post event function we are calling the wall jump slide loop. Now this wall slide is a loop that I'm using. It's like not just a long single one shot SFX. So in order to work with loops, we also might need to have stop events. So as you can see here, I have the player wall jump slide loop, while here I have defined when to stop that loop. Now back to this variable, what this is here for. Now this is very specific to this application. Like this is a handy way I figured out how to tackle a problem. Now the problem I was having while implementing this was that this block of code that this function is using, this block of code is inside the move function. Now somewhere in some script, this move function is being updated constantly on every frame. We don't know where, we don't care where it's being doing that, but it's doing that because when I play the game without, hold up, let me find the function again. Yeah, so this without this variable, if I just save and execute the script, what happens is it continuously posts event for every frame that the player is wall sliding for. So it will constantly keep posting this event. We don't want that. We want to only post this event once when the player is wall sliding. So what I did here was create a custom boolean variable to act as a sort of physical switch. What I'm doing here is giving it a default value of false, because by default the player is not wall sliding. But what we want it to do is we want to check that if it's not false, that if the value for this is false, that is not NWS, and if it if it matches this condition, this block of code will execute for the first time. And on the first run, what we're doing is setting this value to true. And when this becomes true, then this condition is no longer applicable. The if condition won't check for uh, this again, because the value for ws has now become true. So this block of code won't be executed again. It will only execute once. So that's just sort of a trick I figured out to tackle this problem, but this is very specific to this project. Okay, now why I showed you this is to sort of show you how you can use if statements with custom conditions. Now, this is not very complicated because I'm not creating my own variables and my own mechanics and everything. I'm just using what is already available to me. So this variable I'm grounded and this variable is false sliding is already a part of the code. I'm just using that to create a custom condition, and if that condition is true, I'm triggering a wise event. So that's mostly about it for if conditions and posting these sort of conditional events. Next thing we have to look at is the collision of two objects. So we discussed last week in our last session that we use animation events for most things. So while we are designing sounds, we have to be sort of aware that okay, this is the way this is going to be implemented. So if it has an animation event, animation events are your best friend. That's the perfect thing because it makes everyone's work so much easier. So animation events are going to be your first priority. If while designing a sound you think, okay, this is not good for an animation event, so this can either be an if condition or this can either be a collision event. Now we have an animation for hit, but again we don't use that for this particular sound for hit sounds because we are not relying on animation for this. We are relying on the collision of the two objects. How do we know what we are looking for? We see in our player character script there is another function called apply damage that is dealing with the life of the player. Let's go back to Unity and try to understand what we actually need first in order to tackle how to sort of implement this sound. So what we want is for our enemy to make a sound when our player attacks the enemies. Right, this is what we are trying to understand. So since the sound is going to be on the enemy object, let's look at the script of the enemy. Okay, we have the enemy script, and inside which also again we are going to start at the top. We are going to look at the variables. We immediately see there is a life variable, so we need to find a code that is responsible for dealing damage to enemy. And you can see there is a function inside here that's called an apply damage, which okay, that makes sense. That is kind of what we need. And inside this we can ignore all other code, but there's this one line that says life should be decremented. This is a symbol for decremented with whatever value this variable has. And the comment also just gives it away that this is the line that is responsible for dealing damage. Player deals damage to this enemy. Now this is the perfect thing. This is what we need. This is where I can post my hit event for the enemy. Now you will wonder, we just talked about we don't we need this hit event to be like an collision event. We don't really want it to be an animation event or functions or like a function event. So why are we implementing this in our function instead of collisions? Now if you will notice, um, this apply damage is being used in just the block below it inside a collision function. Now this apply damage is not the same as this one, because this apply damage is being called from the character controller script, because our character also has an apply damage function. This apply damage function is responsible to apply the player's hit sound, like the when players is getting damaged, while this is responsible to post it when the enemy is getting damaged. But they're both set up in like a similar way in how it's defined here. So I'm just going to use this block for now to keep everything in one place. So what this is doing is basically checking if the collision is happening with another object that is called player. We are using an if condition for that, and if that is true, then it executes this line of code that is using this apply damage function. Now when this apply damage gets executed, that's when our line that posts event will also get executed. So that is exactly what we need, that is what we want. I can basically just write this AK sound engine statement below this when the collision is happening. That is perfectly fine. But there is no right or wrong way to do things here. I just found that if this function is being called anywhere else, it is simpler to put it in this function instead of just writing this line every time that this collision event is happening. I just put it in the function because it's being called, and it will be called anywhere else if this code is repeating. We don't have to worry about that. Cool. So we saw one basic example of collision, but this is just for hitting enemies. This is a similar setup that most games will have for uh, anything that has to deal with the mechanic of an object being damaged or destroyed. Now, um, that is one way to look at collisions. That is what we did for. That is how we are doing it for the head sounds. But there is another way to look at collisions, that is through colliders. Now, okay, now why this works in the first place is because our objects have this component called as a collider. Now, this collider, if I go to edit collider, you can see this green capsule on my player. This is a collider that is responsible to detect interaction with any other collider that we have in our game. So even for our enemy object, you can see there is a collider. Let me show you. There is a collider which is very similarly set up for as our player. Now these colliders, when they collide, we usually tell them, okay, this collision has happened and Unity needs to do something here. That's the whole purpose of the collision functions. So that's what's enabling these two characters to interact and post the hit event sound. But okay, let's see another way of using these collisions and colliders. Now, in the last week's session, what we discussed was we had the animation events playing the footsteps event, but our default footsteps are set to gravel, and we did not do anything about the switch. I was setting it to the grass switch, but we have two footsteps here, two footsteps group, that is the grass random container and the gravel random container. To do a switch, basically we need to tell Unity that, okay, on this platform, I'm just using this as an example, but like for this platform, I want the footsteps to switch to grass instead of being gravel. That is the default value. Now, the most basic way to do this would be through AK components and colliders. What I've done here is I've put a collider on this platform, and this green collider, when the player's collider hits this, it's going it's going to tell Unity, okay, this is where you have to do a certain action that we define. um, and now what I can simply do is, let me remove this and try again. What I can simply do is add an AK switch component, because I need to switch the footsteps from gravel to grass. I can say trigger on, trigger collision. We have multiple options for AK trigger. What we want is AK trigger enter. We can disable the start, and we only want it to AK trigger enter, and we need to click use other object. This tells Unity that okay, there is an other object, it has to reference whatever object it may be. It has to reference an other object that is going to hit this collider, and we are going to set the switch to our fs switch class. Perfect. That's all we have to do. It's as simple as it gets. In order for this to work, you need to make sure that your collider is tick marked as is trigger. Okay, now what I found was this particular setup only works for 3D games. So in our purpose for this particular project, we have a 2D game. This does not work with our game. That is because if you see for colliders, let me search a collider component. You will see there is there is two types of colliders for every type of collider. What I mean is that for the box collider, we have a box collider 2D, but for this we also have a box collider, which is a 3D cube collider. It should be called cube. I don't know why it's named box. Whatever. But this is what different types of colliders are, and Unity works with 2D and 3D colliders in a different way. So these AK trigger enter, these are all functions we said last week where that we're going to look into this, and this is the perfect time to look into these. So these functions are all 3D functions that are using the Unity's collision 3D functions. We are not going to use this for our project because we are working with a 2D project. But okay, let's see what these do exactly. So something like trigger collision enter and trigger enter are basically the same thing. What these two is, they tell Unity, okay, now another object has entered uh, the collision that is set on this object. So it notifies Unity that it needs to do whatever action it has been set up to do. So that is for AK trigger enter. AK trigger exit is just the opposite. Whenever the object exits the collision, the collision box, collision area, that's when this will trigger. And there are other ways to look at this. You can read about it in the document of the autokinetic, where you will understand more about these trigger on functions. But we are not concerned with those right now. We are only going to look at AK trigger enter and FS switch class. Okay, now since I said this does not work with our purpose, so this will not switch the footsteps. Let me remove this right now. For now, we are not going to work with AK components, but we saw there are collision functions inside Unity. We need to work with that. How do we use that? Now, in our animation event script, I have defined a custom uh, block of code where it's handling the collision between the player and the platform that has the collider. I'm using this function called OnTrigger enter 2D. Now this is a predefined function in Unity. I did not create this function. I'm only using it. Now this function OnTrigger enter 2D is passing two arguments, which is collider 2D, which just tells Unity that this function is supposed to find a collider on this object. So this script is on player object. So it will look for any 2D colliders on this object, and it will check for some other object to do whatever we want it to do. Now we have to tell Unity that okay, this other object, we can tell Unity that this other object has a specific name or a specific tag or a specific feature that we can reference it through, and we can find it through. So what I want is this platform to interact with this player, right? So how do we identify this platform? We have something called as tags in Unity game objects. So each game object can have one tag at a time. We can add tags as we need, but in a lot of the case what will happen is this object might already have a tag that the game is using for some other mechanic. So in that case what we can do is we can simply just create an empty object. I just simply right clicked on the platform object and create empty, which gives us a child object of this platform, and I can set the tag here. I can move all the code that is such as colliders and AK switch everything into this, and this will act on behalf of this platform object. So we can set it up in that way, but for now we don't need this since our platform already has a grass surface tag. So we are using this grass surface tag as an identifier that okay, we are telling Unity that if this other object has a tag grass surface, then we need to set the value for the variable called current surface to grass, or else if it has gravel surface we can just set it to gravel. Now these are the values for these switches. If you see back into our Wwise, these are the values for our switches that we have given, that we have written exactly the way we have written it here in our code. So I just defined a custom variable and gave it a default value for gravel. We don't need this because the default value of gravel is already set in our Wwise, but just to be on the safer side, I'm doing this gravel, and this block of code is executing that whenever this collider 2D on this player object is colliding with another object's collider that has a tag of grass surface, then change the value of this variable to grass. And we are using this variable in our statement ak switch for setting a value for the switch. Now this particular function is using 3 arguments, while our post event function only uses 2. Now you can look up all the different functions that are available to us from the AK Sound Engine class on like Audio Kinetics document, or a quick Google search will give you all the list of all the components of all the functions that we can use. So set switch is used for setting the value for a switch. Now it uses 3 arguments. That is, first one is a switch group. Now back into Wwise, I'm using the FS switch. This FS switch has the grass and gravel switches. So this switch group is what I'm referring to here. We need the switch group and the value of the switch, which is being updated through this variable. And this switch is being posted on the game object. That is this script is attached to. Let's actually test this out to know if it works properly. Let's play. Okay, the other footsteps are distracting, so I'm just going to kill these guys. Okay. Okay, awesome. On this platform, we can clearly hear it switches to footsteps for grass, while on this platform, it's back to gravel because we gave it a tag for gravel and the default value is also gravel. Okay, so that's perfect. That's what we need. We successfully posted this switch for our footsteps. Now, this is exactly why we need to work with collision events, because there are other things. We are not just looking at things that are physically colliding in the world. We might need to trigger certain sounds or trigger certain actions when the player enters a certain area. That's when the collider, this system with the collider works perfectly. We just need to define in this particular area that the player enters, you need to post this event or you need to perform this action like make a switch or set a RTPC value or something. Okay, so far we have seen three types of ways to post events. We have something called as animation events, we have if conditions, and we have collision events. Animation events are just going to post a function in which we can define the post we can define the event that we need to post. If conditions are only triggered if certain conditions are met in the code. We looked at how you can do that, how you can find the proper block of code. And collision events are just responsible when two objects in the game are interacting, they are sort of colliding together. That's when these collision events come into play, and we can post sounds when that collision happens, when the player or the object enters the collision space of another object. Awesome. So those were the three variables that we looked at. Now again, this session was not to teach you the exact lines of code. This was to sort of show you what you need to think about, what you are looking out for when you are working with code. So these scripts, like so many lines of code, we are not concerned with. We do not care, or we do not care to understand what this is doing. What we need is something that will help us post our Wise event in the appropriate place. So, if you're wondering that if you need to learn even the basics of C sharp, if it's going to help you with your sound design, I'd say yes, because um, we don't need to understand the code or mechanics of the game development entirely, but it becomes easier to at least work with the game when we know what we are looking at. So if I had to do code, like I'm not very well versed with C sharp either, but like I know how to read the code at least. If I know the basics of the C sharp, like whatever we discussed with functions and variables and if statements, if I know these are the basic things, if you know this, I can at least read what's in the code, even though I do not understand the code itself. Like all these events, I don't know, I don't care about those, but I know, like, okay, this is a function, this is a variable, this is an if statement, and it's using a certain condition. If I know at least that much, then I can work with code. That's all I need, that's more than enough. And that brings us to the end of day 3. um, Tomorrow in the next session we are going to look at posting RTPCs as well as how to work with interactive music. These two are my favorite topics in game audio, so I'm looking forward to that. And interactive music is, we are going to look at the Wwise system as well as the Unity's system to handle that as well. So yeah, thank you guys for joining today, and hope you learned something new. And I'll see you guys tomorrow.